They sent a queen to end us. We sent a boy who wouldn't stop. The last broadcast from Tranquil Station 7 reached Earth on a Tuesday morning, local time in Omaha, Nebraska, at 6:14 a.m. The operator on duty, a retired postal worker named Gerald Fitch, who volunteered nights and weekends because he liked the quiet hum of the equipment, transcribed the signal before the static swallowed it whole. He read it back twice, then he called his supervisor. Then he made a pot of coffee, sat down in his chair, and stared at the wall until somebody with more rank than him figured out what to do about the fact that there was, apparently, a queen, and she was coming. Freddie Michkowski was 9 years old when the Varathi arrived. He was 10 when they took his father. He was 11 when Captain Valador walked up the cracked front steps of what used to be the Michkowski house and said, simply, "Get your coat, we're going to get him back." Freddie didn't ask how. He didn't ask if it was possible. He was 11 years old in a world that had collapsed around him like a bad magic trick. And the man on his front steps was wearing a patched flight jacket with a rank insignia that no longer meant anything, except to people who still believed it did. Freddie had spent 2 years deciding to believe in things. Captain Valador was one of them. He got his coat. The Varathi did not announce themselves the way science fiction had prepared humanity to expect. There was no vast shadow falling across a major city, no hovering monolith, no beam of white light and a booming translated voice. What happened instead was quieter and more frightening. Signals went dark, one by one, like lights going out in a house at the end of a street. Observation posts in orbit, unmanned relay stations, the deep field listening arrays that humanity had quietly pushed out past the asteroid belt over the preceding decade. Dark, dark, dark. Then, over a period of 72 hours, the first ships appeared in low Earth orbit. Not an armada, something more unsettling, a patrol. 6 ships, moving with the casual certainty of something that owned the space it moved through. The way a landlord walks through a property they haven't visited in a while. Taking stock, Dr. Laura Voss, lead xenolinguist at the hastily assembled International Contact Bureau, described the first Varathi transmission as follows. It was less a greeting and more a notation. The way you'd write something on a checklist. A category confirmed. A box ticked. She paused before adding, "The box was us." The Varathi were bilateral, roughly humanoid in silhouette, but the resemblance ended at the outline. Their bodies were encased in a secreted exoskeletal resin that hardened into something stronger than any known ceramic composite. They had no faces in any sense that humanity had imagined faces. They had input structures, sensory arrays arranged in concentric circles where a mouth and nose might have been, surrounded by 4 optical clusters capable of independent focus. They did not smile or frown. Their emotional states were communicated through chromatic shifts in the resin plating along their thorax. Red was aggression. A deep iridescent green was something that linguists cautiously labeled contempt. They were almost always green. Their queen. The Varathi did not use that word, but Dr. Voss used it because no human word was closer. Was a being known in intercepted transmissions only as Lothavreth Sky, which translated, imperfectly, as she who calcates the end of things. She did not appear in person. Her presence was transmitted through a bioelectric relay that made every screen, every radio, every piece of glass in the visible vicinity resonate with her broadcast. She spoke and walls hummed. Windows fogged from the inside. Animals went still. She told humanity what was going to happen. She did not phrase it as a threat. She phrased it as a schedule. What was going to happen according to the schedule was extraction. Humanity's biosphere was compatible with a secondary Varathi colonial function. The dominant population, meaning humans, would be relocated to processing centers while the planet was prepared. The timeline was 18 standard Varathi cycles. There would be no negotiation because the calculation had already been completed. The outcome was not in question. Lothavreth Sky ended her transmission with a phrase that Dr. Voss translated, exhaustedly, as, "Resistance is a variable we have already accounted for." She was right in the sense that she had accounted for it. She was wrong, in the way that anyone who has never met a genuinely stubborn human is always wrong. Captain Rick Arnell had been flying since he was 16 years old. He was 43 now, with a bad left knee, a work reputation, and a Varathi bounty on his head that his crew treated as a point of professional pride. They had it printed on a card that they passed around at the beginning of particularly bad missions, like a good luck charm. Phil Farrell, Photon to everyone who'd flown with him, had laminated it. "Keeps the moisture off," he explained when anyone asked. The crew of the retrofitted atmospheric transport vessel informally designated the Tranquil Run. so named because absolutely nothing about its operational history had ever been tranquil, was not a military unit in any official sense. What it was the closest thing humanity's resistance network had to a surgical instrument. They hit things that needed to be hit. They extracted things that needed to be extracted. They disappeared into places that larger, louder, more important organizations couldn't fit into. They were also, Rick thought privately, the only crew in the network crazy enough to attempt what Valador was proposing. Walk me through it again, Rick said. He was not asking because he hadn't understood. He was asking the way a man asks a doctor to repeat a diagnosis, because hearing it twice makes the impossible feel slightly more like a thing that has already happened. Valador spread the schematics across the table, in the belly of the Tranquil Run. Beside him, Freddy sat on an overturned crate, watching with the focused attention of a child who has decided that everything that is happening is connected, and that if he pays close enough attention, find the thread that ties it all together. The Varathi processing centers operate on a hive relay architecture, Valador said. He tapped the central point on the schematic, a structure that looked, in cross-section, like a spider's web built inside a cathedral. Every signal, every security command, every lock, every extraction protocol, it all routes through the central relay. Here, the throne, Phil said from where he was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, eating a protein bar with the calm expression of a man who had made peace with unlikely odds. That's what the network calls it, yes. Because the queen sits there, Freddy said quietly, not asking, stating. Valador looked at the boy. A flicker of something, not pity, not softness exactly, but recognition, moved through his expressions and was gone. Yes, Lothavreth's Sky conducts the entire processing operation from a central chamber in the relay core. She doesn't just oversee it, she is it. Her bioelectric signature is the authentication key for every system in the facility. So the place only runs because she's in it, Rick said. Correct. And if she's not in it, every lock opens. Every cage releases. Every door defaults to the last human-compatible position because the facility was built on a substrate of captured human infrastructure that defaults to our protocols in the absence of Varathi override. The table was quiet for a moment. You're not talking about destroying the facility, Laura Voss said. She was sitting at the far end of the table, her translation equipment folded in her lap like a sleeping cat. Her voice was careful, precise. The voice of someone who understood that the difference between one word and another could mean everything. You're talking about getting her out of her throne. Yes, and how exactly, Rick said. Do you propose to do that? Valador didn't answer immediately. He looked at Freddy instead. Freddy reached into the pocket of his coat and pulled out a small device. It was modest in appearance, a modified transmitter, the kind used for short-range signal work, no larger than a deck of playing cards. He had spent 4 months building it. He had consulted every piece of documentation Laura had assembled on Varathi bioelectric communication. He had burned through 2 prototypes that didn't work, 1 prototype that worked too well, and nearly took out the lights in a 3-block radius, and arrived at this. He set it on the table. She broadcasts herself, Freddy said. The Queen. Every time she speaks, she pushes her bioelectric signature out through everything nearby. Windows, walls, radio equipment. He paused. He had his father's voice, quiet, certain, not trying to persuade anyone of anything, just reporting what was true. But broadcast is a 2-way architecture. You can push a signal out. You can also pull one in. Phil picked up the device very carefully. He turned it over, he put it down. Kid, he said. Are you telling me this thing pulls her signal? It mimics her signal, Freddy corrected. It generates a copy of her bioelectric broadcast and retransmits it back at her, amplified through the relay core's own infrastructure. Basically, you make the building think she's everywhere at once, Laura said softly. And when a hive relay system receives a conflicting identical signal from multiple nodes simultaneously, Valador said, it initiates a source verification lockdown. Every process halts. Every authentication check suspends. Every override fails. She has to physically move to a verification point to re-authenticate herself, Rick said slowly. She has to leave the throne. For approximately 4 minutes, Freddy said. Maybe 5, depending on the architecture of the specific facility. I've modeled it 600 times. The window is consistent. The silence on the Tranquil Run was of a particular quality. The silence of people who are doing math they didn't expect to pass. Phil broke it first. He reached into his jacket, pulled out the laminated bounty card, and slid it down the table toward Freddy. You should have this, he said. You've earned it more than any of us. The Varathi processing facility, designated HX7, occupied what had once been a stretch of Kansas farmland. From the outside, it had the appearance of something grown rather than built. Resin spires rising from a central dome, dark and iridescent, catching light in a way that made the eye want to look away. Around its perimeter, patrols moved in precise overlapping arcs. The Varathi were methodical, they were consistent. They had, as Lothar had noted, accounted for resistance. What they had not accounted for was Rick Arnold deciding, at 0300 hours on a cold November morning, to fly the Tranquil run at treetop level for 60 kilometers, with the running lights off and the engines throttled down to a whisper. He had been flying since he was 16. He had a bad left knee and a worse reputation. He landed the Tranquil run in a drainage ditch 300 meters from the facility's eastern wall, without so much as bending the landing struts. Like I always say, he announced to no one in particular, skill is just stubbornness applied to a technical problem. No one has ever heard you say that before, Phil said, already moving toward the hatch. I'm going to start saying it, sounds good. They moved fast. Laura first because her translation equipment would be needed at the first security checkpoint. The Varathi used a rotating cipher protocol that was beyond brute force but not beyond a human who had spent 18 months doing nothing but reading captured transmissions in a cramped basement in what used to be Topeka. Phil behind her, carrying the kind of equipment that Resistance Network Supply manifests listed as signal interference packages, and that everyone in the field called the loud option. Rick at the rear, moving with the particular gait of a man who has been in too many tight places to be frightened by one more. And Freddie, in the middle of the formation, the device in his coat pocket, his father's voice in his memory, repeating a thing he used to say when Freddie was scared of the dark. Just keep walking toward it. The dark doesn't get bigger. Your eyes just need time to adjust. The eastern wall had 3 checkpoints. They were through 2 of them inside 6 minutes. Laura, working the cipher at a speed that made Phil mutter something reverent under his breath. And at the 3rd, they hit the kind of complication that no plan survives contact with. A patrol. Not on the schedule, not in the intelligence they had. Just there, the way trouble is always just there, having decided independent of anyone's planning to be exactly where it was. There were 4 Varathi. Their resin plating caught the facility's ambient light. Their thorax markings shifted slowly toward the deep iridescent green that meant they had noticed something they did not expect, which meant the calculation was tipping, which meant Rick stepped forward. He stepped forward the way a person steps in front of something to block the view of it, without deliberation, without calculation, as if his body had simply made a decision that his brain hadn't finished processing yet. He put himself between the patrol and the rest of the team, and he looked at the nearest Varathi, at the sensory arrays arranged in concentric circles where a face would have been. And he did something that 43 years of knowing humans could not have predicted. He smiled. Not a smile of bravado, not a smile that was performing courage, a real one. The kind that appears on a face when something deeply, completely absurd is happening, and there's no point pretending otherwise. Hell of a night, he said conversationally. The Varathi paused. This was not a variable that had been accounted for. Laura, moving behind him, whispered 4 words of Varathi into her translation device. The device pulsed once. 3 of the 4 patrol members' thorax markings shifted from green to a confused amber, the color of a system receiving a command it was not expecting. The 4th started to raise its secondary appendage. Phil's signal interference package handled the 4th. The window was 30 seconds, maybe less. They moved through it. The throne room of HX7 was not what any of them had imagined. They had imagined something vast, dramatic, architecturally expressing dominance. What they found was closer to the inside of a nautilus shell, a curved chamber lined with bioelectric relays, each one pulsed soft really in a rhythm that matched exactly the rhythm that Laura had noted in every Varathi transmission she had ever transcribed. The rhythm of a single being's nervous system, amplified to fill a building. The rhythm of the Queen. Lothar was in the center of it still. She was larger than the soldiers. The resin plating on her form was a deeper black, shot through with bioluminescent threads that pulsed in time with the chamber's rhythm. Her sensory arrays were not directed at the intruders. They were directed at everything simultaneously, a being that was at that moment so fully distributed across a system that it was barely a singular entity anymore. She was the building. She was the locks on every door. She was the weight around the wrists of every human being in every processing cell in the facility. Freddy stood at the threshold of the chamber and looked at her. He thought about his father. He thought about the morning they came, the sound of the transport vehicle, the way his father had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at Freddy with an expression that was trying very hard to be calm and was almost succeeding, the way he'd said, quietly, "I'll be back before you know it," which was something adults said when they didn't know if it was true, but wanted it to be so badly that they said it anyway. Freddy reached into his coat pocket and turned on the device. The chamber sang. It was not a metaphor. The bioelectric relays that lined the walls received Freddy's amplified signal and did exactly what he had modeled 600 times. They rebroadcast it, node to node. A cascade of false authentication that told the Hive relay architecture that its queen was everywhere at once. The chamber's rhythm stuttered. The throne's pulse fragmented. Lothavreth became, for the first time in perhaps her entire existence, uncertain. Her sensory arrays snapped to the intruders. She saw the boy. She saw the device in his hands. The iridescent threads in her resin shifted through a color sequence that Laura had never seen before in any captured transmission. "What is she saying?" Rick asked quietly. Laura looked at her equipment, looked up. "She's saying," she paused, recalibrating. "She's asking how. Not how did we get here. How did we know how to do this?" "Tell her," Freddy said, "that I had a lot of time to think about it." Laura translated. Lothavreth's sky was still for a beat of exactly 3 seconds. Then, because the system verification protocol demanded it, because her own architecture gave her no choice, she moved. She left the throne. The building exhaled. Every lock in HX7 defaulted. Every cage released. Every door opened to the last human-compatible position. The lights in the corridors went from Varathi amber to the particular color of fluorescent bulbs in a Kansas processing facility, because it turned out the lights had been Kansas fluorescent all along, under the amber overlay, just waiting for someone to turn off the filter. Rick found Freddy's father in Block 7, Section C, third door from the corridor junction. He was thinner than the photograph Freddy carried. His hair had gone gray at the temples. He was sitting on the floor of a cell that had 20 seconds ago had no door handle on the inside, and he was looking at the door that had just swung open with the expression of a man who has spent a long time in the dark and whose eyes need time to adjust. He looked up at Rick. Rick jerked a thumb over his shoulder. "There's a kid outside," he said. "Been looking for you." The 4-minute window was 4 minutes and 22 seconds. In the end, because Varathi verification architecture had one additional redundancy that Freddy's models had not accounted for, a secondary bioelectric checkpoint located 11 meters from the primary. It added 18 seconds to the delay on Lothavreth's reauthentication. 18 seconds was the margin by which Phil got the last corridor gate open. 17 seconds would have been the margin by which they didn't. Phil noted this afterward, sitting in the back of the Tranquil Run as it cleared Kansas airspace and climbed toward the cloud layer, and said, with the calm of a man who had processed the information and made a philosophical decision about it, "I'm going to stop thinking about that." "Probably wise," Rick agreed, flying. In the back, Freddy sat next to his father. They were not talking. His father had his arm around Freddy's shoulders, and Freddy had the laminated bounty card in one hand and the device in the other, and the device was powered down now, quiet. Just a thing made of salvage parts and 18 months of reading documentation in a basement. His father looked at the device for a long moment. He had an engineer's instinct. He could see, in the arrangement of components, the long, careful thought behind it. He looked at his son. "When did you build this?" he asked. Freddy considered the question. "Right after they took you," he said. "I needed something to do." His father was quiet for a while. Outside the Tranquil Run's small windows, the cloud layer broke around them, and above it the sky was the particular black and star-scattered dark of early morning at altitude, which looks, if you have ever gone looking for things in it, exactly like the inside of a space serial. The kind shot in black and white, in the 1950s, on a budget, by people who believed that the story was bigger than the effects. "Your mother used to sing," his father said quietly, "when she was working something through. Humming, mostly. I don't know if you remember." Freddy didn't answer for a moment. "I remember," he said. Lothavreth's reauthenticated herself at ZO 347 hours. The system restored to full Varathi control at ZO 348. The cells were empty. The facility log showed, in the dry notation of a system doing what systems do, that 412 individuals had been released during the 7-minute lockdown window. She reviewed the security footage of the throne chamber. She reviewed it 3 times. Then she sent a transmission to the Varathi command relay that, when Dr. Laura Voss later translated it, had no direct equivalent in any human language, but which she rendered as closely as possible as a combination of the words anomalous, unscheduled, and in a category that Varathi notation reserved only for variables that had exceeded their projected boundaries to a degree requiring category revision, impossible. She was, the transmission noted, revising the category. The resistance network received the Tranquil Run's return signal at 0521 hours. There were, at that point in the Resistance's operational history, 11 major processing facilities active on Earth's surface. HX-7 was the second to have been successfully breached. It would not be the last. The model that Freddie Maxkowski had built, not the physical device, but the operational model, the understanding of how a hive relay architecture responded to signal conflict, was distributed to every technical cell in the network within 48 hours. It was understood, studied, adapted, and built upon in 17 different ways by 17 different teams in 12 different countries. Freddie was 12 years old when the third facility fell. He was 12 years old and 3 months when the fourth did. He was 12 years old and 4 months when Lothvrethsky, in a transmission that Laura Voss translated alone in a room with the door closed, because she needed a moment with what it said before she shared it, formally noted in her command relay that the resistance variable had exceeded projected parameters by a factor that required not revision, but complete recalculation. She was, the transmission said, beginning again. Laura sat in the room with the door closed and allowed herself, for exactly 90 seconds, to smile. Captain Valader did not make speeches. He had a reputation in the network for being a man of limited words, used precisely. The kind of economy that comes not from coldness but from a long acquaintance with situations where there is simply no time for anything more than what is essential. What he said to Freddie, the morning after they returned from HX-7 was this: "Your father's home. Your device worked. 412 people are sleeping somewhere that isn't a cage tonight." He paused. He had the flight jacket with the patched insignia. He reached into the breast pocket and pulled out a small object, a rank pin, old, scratched, the kind that had been made before the Varathi arrived, when rank meant something to a system that still existed. He held it out. "The title doesn't mean what it used to," he said, "but it means what we decide it means, and we've decided." Freddie took the pin. He looked at it for a long moment. He thought about the house with the cracked front steps. He thought about the boy who had stood in that house for 2 years, deciding to believe in things. He pinned it on. The war lasted 4 more years. It was not clean. It was not a serial, ending each episode on a cliffhanger that resolved neatly in the next. People died who shouldn't have. Facilities were breached and others fell. Lothvrethsky adapted. She was not stupid, not slow, not a villain who existed only to be defeated. She was a calculating intelligence of formidable capability, who had, for the first time in her operational existence, encountered a variable she had not fully accounted for. What she had not accounted for was not the technology, it was not the tactics, it was not the courage, although there was courage. It was not the stubbornness, although there was stubbornness in quantities that she found, according to Laura Voss's translations, genuinely difficult to categorize. What she had not accounted for was the thing that a boy in a basement does when the people he loves are taken from him, and he doesn't have an army or a weapon or a plan, but he has time, and he has patience, and he has quiet certain knowledge that understanding a system deeply enough is the same as finding its seam. She had calculated resistance. She had not calculated curiosity. She had not calculated the thing that makes a human being, sitting in the ruins of a world that has just been reclaimed by something vast and indifferent, pick up whatever is nearby and try to understand how it works. Not from strategy, not from duty, because understanding is, for humans, as involuntary as breathing. She had not calculated a boy who, instead of fearing the signal the Queen broadcast through every window and wall, listened to it, and built something that listened back. The last Varathi vessel left Earth's orbit on a morning in March. Low cloud cover over most of the northern hemisphere, the kind of gray, quiet morning that arrives after a long winter, and before anyone is certain spring will hold. Phil Farrell watched it go from the roof of what had been a gas station outside Topeka, and was now, by informal consensus, the Resistance Network's regional headquarters for about 11 square miles. He had a cup of coffee that was 60% reconstituted powder and 40% determination. He watched the ship's drive flare once against the cloud layer, bright and brief, and then it was gone. He thought about saying something memorable. He drank his coffee instead. Freddie Mixkowski was 16 years old on the morning the last ship left. He was standing with his father on the porch of a house that was not the house where he had grown up. That house was gone, like a lot of things, but which had a porch, which was enough. His father had a cup of tea. Freddie had the laminated bounty card in his jacket pocket, which was where it had lived for 4 years. Worn at the edges now, the laminate cracked at one corner. His father looked up at the sky, at the cloud cover, and the nothing above it. "I'll be back before you know it," Freddie said quietly. His father looked at him. "You're not going anywhere," his father said. "I know," Freddie said. "That's the point." His father was quiet for a moment. Then he laughed, a short, real, slightly surprised laugh, the kind that happens when something is true enough to be funny. They stood on the porch. The clouds were ordinary clouds. The sky was, for the first time in 5 years, just the sky. Somewhere in the transit corridors between star systems, aboard a command vessel, moving at speeds that made human concepts of distance meaningless, Lotha Vreth Sky reviewed the final operational report for Earth. She reviewed the documentation, the analysis, the variable cataloging. She reviewed the signal data from HX7. She reviewed the transcript of the 17 different adaptations of one boy's model. She reviewed the 4 years of contact, the trajectory of resistance, the rate at which a species that had, according to every prior calculation, no meaningful capacity to counter Varathi operations had, in practice, countered them. She considered adding a notation to the operational file, a category note, a formal acknowledgement that the projections had been insufficient. She found, instead, that the notation she wanted to add had no equivalent in Varathi administrative language. The closest approximation, if one were to attempt a translation through a xenolinguist who had spent years learning to find words for things that had no words, would have been something like this. "They learned from us faster than we calculated, and then they taught us something we didn't know we needed to learn." She did not add the notation. Varathi administrative language had no structure for recording a lesson learned from a species you had underestimated. She flagged the file for revision. She began for the 3rd time to recalculate. Somewhere on the surface of a quiet planet, a boy with a cracked laminate card in his jacket pocket stood on a porch and watched ordinary clouds move across an ordinary sky, and hummed under his breath a tune that his mother used to sing. He didn't know he was doing it. He was already thinking about the next problem.